Okay, so this video is pretty much going to serve as my answer to the Q&A from both last month and also this month. I know this is in October, but this is pretty much the September Q&A. And so we did obviously the live Q&A, and we're still gonna do the live Q&A, and so pretty much what that is I just make myself available at 6 Eastern, for 2 hours as a slot, on the usually the last Friday of a month. So we're still gonna keep that, but what we generally found is that people like to send in questions, and it actually gives a little bit more time to kind of go over them and whatnot. So that's what this is going to be, and this is kind of a compile of questions over the past 2 months. I did answer some questions, so if this is a little bit of a rehash, and you've kind of already seen my answer to this either personally or elsewhere, then apologies for that. But it's still probably going to be useful to you. So let's get into the first thing, and the first thing is a question from kind of way back, and it was how do you go about selecting spring rates? And I'm gonna use an oval kind of explanation for this, but it's true for all cars really. And what it comes down to is the stiffer the spring that you choose to run, the I don't want to say better ride height control you get, because that's kind of a subjective term. But you will get for a stiffer spring, you will get a smaller variance between corner heights versus straightaway heights. And that's just because obviously when you go into the corner, you get a lot more load on the spring, and a softer spring compresses further. That's just how that works. Now, that kind of gives you the idea that, why don't I just stick the stiffest possible spring in, because surely that's the best idea, right? If the stiffest spring moves the least, then that'll be great, because then I'll get the least ride height variance between the corners and the straightaways, and in downforce cars I'll go really, really fast. And to an extent you're right, and that's why high downforce cars will run really stiff springs, because they're all about the platform control. But there are going to be situations where the gain in platform control becomes very, very small. And because that gain in platform control becomes very, very small, you start to run into disadvantages in other areas. And the big disadvantage of running really stiff spring is the roughness of the track will begin to upset the tire quite a bit. And the softer the spring you run, the kind of more overall compliance you've got through the system. So when you encounter a rough section of the track, there's a lot of movement in the suspension, which means the tire doesn't have to basically soak it up, and the load variation on the tire will be less. And pretty much the more you can reduce the load variation on the tire, the more grip you're going to have. And it's a little bit of a strange concept to get around, but the way to think about it really is kind of that, if you imagine something vibrating around really, really, really quickly, and you think kind of how much that's sort of contacting anything that it's touching, it's not going to be in contact with it for much time at all, and it's kind of the same deal here with a tire. So that's what the trade-off is. The stiffer the spring you have, the better the platform control is, but the worse, or the more severe the tire load variation is. And the tire load variation manifests itself as basically a loss of overall grip. So that's where the balance comes in. And to illustrate this, I've done quite a crude paint drawing here, but I'm hopeful that this will get the point across quite well. So if we can imagine this here is say turn 1 and 2 at an oval track. Let's just say this is turn 1 and 2 at Las Vegas or something like that. So the high points in the chart, they're the straightaways. This low point in the middle where all these lines are overlapping each other, let's just say that's 1 and 2. And then again, this is corner exit. So we've got entry, middle, and exit here. So what are these lines representing? Well, let's imagine that these lines are each spring increment as 1,000 pounds. So let's just say that the green line is 1,000 pounds, the yellow line is 2,000 pounds, blue is 3, the pink is 4, the cyan is 5. the red is 6 and the white at the bottom is 7. Now, it's a paint drawing, okay? So don't come at me about my paint drawing skills. Let's just accept that these in the middle can be considered to all be overlapping each other. So what we're trying to say there is we're saying that sort of the datum height in the middle of the corner is the same on all of them. And that's because that's what you're targeting, okay? So say you're targeting a 1/2 inch ride height. If you're targeting a 1/2 inch ride height in the middle of the corner, you will set the car up so that say for example, the splitter is a 1/2 inch off the track. So that's going to be the same no matter what spring you use, if that's your target. The difference is going to be when the car unloads and comes up onto the straight, or before it loads up and its height running down the straightaway. And in the simplest of terms, the softer the spring, the higher the height down the straightaway. That's where plate tracks, even though there's no such thing anymore technically. So Talladega, Daytona, we tend to run extremely stiff springs because we kind of have more grip than we need, you know, like we're full throttle around the whole track, so we can afford to give up some tire grip in favor of aero platform control so that we can get less drag. But as you can see here, obviously the 1,000 pounds per inch spring, the green one, is going to run at a vastly higher ride height down the straightaway compared to, say, even our yellow 2,000 pounds per inch spring. And then again, compared with our 3,000 on the blue and the 4,000 on the pink and so on. But the important thing to note here is that you can run this test yourself and you will find that this is the result you get. So this isn't, it's exaggerated for the purpose of this video, but it's not fake. This is what you will see. When you make jumps towards the lower end of the spring rates, so say between 1,000 and 2,000, you will see that the platform control increases drastically. So this is why you don't run the opposite end. This is why you don't run a completely soft spring, because even though a soft spring is great for tire load variation because it's very, very good at obviously soaking everything up, it's really, really terrible for platform control, and you will lose out a lot of aero. Because you're running this high down the straightaway. And really, the area that we're actually interested in the most is kind of this transitional zone here between when it's on the straightaways and really high up, and then before it drops down to our target height in the corner. Because this is what you feel when you're driving the car. It's if the splitter is too high entering the corner, it manifests itself as that the car doesn't really have any initial turn in and bite because there's just no front downforce. And that makes sense. You think the splitter, for the most part, the closer we get it to the ground, there is a limit on this. You can get to the point where it's too low, but for the most part, the closer we get it to the ground, the better it works, the more downforce we get on the nose of the car. So obviously we don't want a situation where the nose is popping up on exit, because then we're losing downforce whilst we're still turning. That's not good. That's not what we want. Or on entry where we're turning in and the nose is so high that it's not producing us a lot of downforce. But what you see here is that the difference with each 1,000 pounds increment of spring, or hopefully if my drawing's coming across well enough, gets smaller each time. So you get a big difference between 1,000 and a 2,000, which is great. So there's a big improvement there. But then you go from a 2,000 to 3,000, and the improvement's still quite big in terms of platform control. So you might want to head that kind of direction and whatnot. And then again, when you go from a 3,000 to a 4,000, again, it's quite big, you know. So maybe we're wanting to look at kind of that area. But then if you say, if we look at the very, very, very bottom, and you say here we've got the red is a 6,000 and the white is a 7,000, that difference there is almost negligible. So for the vast majority of cars, there's going to be no or very, very, very minimal advantage to you running a 7,000 over a 6,000. You're going to this is the point where you're definitely overlapping into the point where the tire load variation is losing you more grip than you're gaining in an aero grip sense. So when you get down to this area, this is where it becomes a lot about fine-tuning and margins, and this is where the track influence comes in as well. So obviously the smoother track, you can get away with running the stiffer spring because there's less bumps, which means there's inherently less load variation. So say tracks like a Kansas or something, you get away with running a really stiff spring. You try and run that at Charlotte, you're not going to have a fun time, because you'll find that then, and Charlotte's actually a really good track to do this test at, because if you did this at Charlotte, you'd find that when you get to the stiffer end of the springs, the car's really, really not going to want to turn as you're going through 3 and 4. But this is a trap that's very easy to fall into, because obviously if you keep increasing the spring stiffness and you're looking at this purely in terms of ride heights and on telemetry, you are going to keep seeing a benefit in terms of platform control. And that's going to push you towards using the stiffer and stiffer and stiffer and stiffer springs. And that's kind of a natural thing to do, you know, like if your focus is platform control, then stiffer springs is going to be what you're after. But it comes down to how sensitive is the car, and really what you want is you want to be able to back the spring off as much as possible before you start to lose a noticeable amount of aero. So if say you start at a 7,000 and you back off to a 6,000, in that case, you're probably going to get faster because your difference in ride height control is so small, but the difference in load variation will be relatively large. So you'll get a good gain from that. You'll probably actually pick up speed. Then if you say you go from a 6,000 to a 5,000, again, it's probably, you know, that's a margin there in terms of ride height control for the purpose of this example. But say you go from the 6,000 to 5,000, you might find that, again, you gain a little bit of speed going down to the 5,000. But then you go from the 5,000 to the 4,000 and you find that you actually lost a bit of speed. But the thing is, how much speed did you really lose? And is that hot lap speed or is that over a run speed? If you put those two cars out there for 40 laps, is the 4,000 still slower by the end of the 40 laps? You'd have to run the test and find out yourself. But that's where there is a little bit of an art in this, because it's not just a simple case of looking at it and going, hey, this gives me the best ride height control, I'm going to run the maximum stiffness springs. But at the same time, it's also why you can't just go and put the softest possible springs in a car and call it a day kind of thing, because you'll start to lose performance. So that's kind of what you're fighting here, and that's what you need to be looking at. You need to be looking at what point do the tire load variation, which unfortunately there's, as far as I'm aware, with the outputs that we have, there isn't a great way of analyzing this. So that's something that's a bit of an unknown, and the only thing that's going to tell you that is going to be lap times. But obviously, platform control, you can clearly see. So that's my answer to that. How do I go about selecting spring rates? I try and find how, depending on how you want to look at it, how stiff I can be without getting to the point where I'm hurting the tire, or how soft I can go without hurting the aero. So hopefully that's what you guys were after when you were asking that, in terms of how to go about selecting spring rates, and this is always what I'm fighting with that. Moving on to the next question. So this is kind of quite a different question actually. Raphael asked, how do you deal with getting nervous in the beginning of an important race? So that's really challenging. For me personally, I find that the closer I get to kind of the race start, and especially the closer I get to qualifying, the less and less I want to talk to people. So I'll kind of try and get into my own sort of quiet zone at that point. And I know the guys who've worked with me will know that the thing I like the absolute least is people asking me questions right as we're about to start qualifying, because I have in the past just turned around and gone, hey, I just don't want to talk about that right now. We can figure this out later, you know. So for me, I don't like to be kind of being barraged with questions. I kind of like to have a little bit of a quiet time, and I mean that can, depending on the race, that can extend out to quite a substantial amount of time before the race, even maybe a full hour or so. So that's a big part for me. Another thing is just making sure that everything is kind of nailed on and figured out. So if you got any programs that you need to have running, things like JRT and trading paints, all that kind of stuff, just making sure that they are all working as you expect them to. You're not going to run into any errors with them and that kind of thing. They've got all the outputs that you need and so on and so forth. And just making sure that everything works and making sure that there's no unexpected surprises in say, an equipment sense. And the other the other thing with this is practicing everything that is relevant. So for me, obviously, with a lot of oval races and a lot of endurance races when I do them, there is an aspect to pit stop practice, whether that be kind of hot pit on a 1.5 mile or just kind of a regular road course pit entry and that kind of thing. I always like to practice those because they are areas where you can gain a lot of time on the guys that didn't practice them through nothing that you're doing to the car and that kind of thing. And that gives me more confidence going into races, knowing that I've practiced these things and knowing that I can push the limits on them and so on. And same with qualifying, really, is it comes down to having a set kind of rhythm. And I always replace my all-time best lap with a qualifying lap time, so that I can have that up on the screen when I'm doing the qualifying lap. And obviously, if the weather conditions are similar, it's really handy in that sense. I'm able to reference directly to a feasible lap time, so to speak. And that kind of all calms me down and gives me confidence that I've prepared for the race, and as long as I just match to the things that I prepared for, I don't try and overdo it or anything like that, then it's going to work out. So that would be my answer. But I did ask a couple of other guys as well. Some of the guys from various pro series. The big thing that came through is a lot of them said it's mainly self-confidence. It's mainly self-confidence and feeling like you've done all the necessary preparation for anything that might happen. So say in an oval sense, it's restart practices, that kind of thing, practicing what lines you're going to run, figuring out where you can make passes, all that sort of thing. And you don't want to get into your own head about what might happen, kind of thing. So it's going to be a little bit different because a lot of the guys I spoke to about this were from the oval side, but I did have some input from a road driver. So I'll let you know what they said as well. And they were saying that a lot of it can actually come down to a physical side of things as well, in terms of controlling breathing. Actually, was a big point that was mentioned, and trying to prevent yourself from getting too excited in that sense. But kind of interestingly, also trying to prevent yourself from kind of winding down too much at the same time. So just trying to find out your own sort of happy place, I suppose, and trying to make sure that you stay in that window, especially through qualifying and into the race. But the big things that came through from everybody was it's all about preparation, and it's all about everything you do before the race rather than the race itself. And it's about having confidence in what you've done and that you've done all the work that's necessary and it's just going to pay off. So that's definitely a big factor in this. The next question was from Brad, and it was, could you explain the aero tables and calculator and how to use them? Okay, so this stemmed a little bit from a Discord conversation where I was playing around with the GTE cars, and I was actually trying to put together some things that were intended to help out a little bit with kind of working out where the aero balance and whatnot was in GTE cars. Now that they've been given a aero calculator in the garage. So what you want to do with the aero calculators is they are there for a couple of purposes. Now, in the most basic sense, like they are in the GTE cars, it's all about looking at various points around the track to figure out what your specific aero balance is. So in that sense, you kind of can pick points around a track. So for example, say you're struggling with a car a little bit in a high-speed corner, but you're not struggling with it anywhere else. It's purely in the middle of a high-speed corner where you're finding it's pretty unstable. What you want to do is you want to go and look around the track, find that specific corner, find that point where you're finding that the balance is a bit unstable. And in telemetry, you want to look at what your average front height is and what your average rear height is at that point. You want to take a snapshot of that, and then you'll go into the garage, you'll look at the aero calculator, and you'll input those numbers into that portion of the garage screen in terms of your ride heights that box that says ride height at speed. So it's important to note that anything you change in that aero calculator area that's to do with ride heights, that's not actually changing anything physical on the car. Those are just there for calculation purposes. So the numbers you put in there, they will run through whatever is kind of behind the scenes, and underneath that it will give you a readout that says what your forwards usually aero balance is, and what you use the aero calculator for is to tell you what your aero balance is. So you'll take your values from telemetry and you'll input them into there in the garage screen. It'll spit you out a number. Say it spits out something that's like 47.5% or something. So then you can kind of box that for later. And you can go back to kind of what you were thinking about in terms of, okay, so I was going through this corner and I found that it wasn't particularly handy. It was a little bit too loose. You can then say, okay, well that's probably my limit is 47.5. So you can kind of store that for later on. And you can also then make changes off of that. So if you look at the aero calculator and you go, okay, I want to try 0.5% less, you might find that just dropping if you move the rear height at speed and you just make a couple of millimeter adjustment to that, you might find that, say, dropping it 3 millimeters might be 0.5% or something, and that might give you like 47%. And then what you would then do is go into the actual setup side of the garage. You would make a 3 millimeter rear height change, drop it down, and then you would take that out for a run around the track and see if that fixed your issue. And that's again where things can then get more complicated from that point onwards, because then you can include things like wing angle, and again you'll see in the aero calculator when you change the wing angle, the aero balance will move as well. And that's really the most basic sense of what you can use it for, and how you can use it to influence your setup. Because then in the future, what you can do is, obviously, well, you'll find out points where if the aero balance is beyond a certain point, you just won't. You know that you yourself are not going to be able to have a good time with that setup. So you can take that information and go, okay, so the aero balance in this setup might be 48%, and you know that you're not happy with anything over 47%, and then you can either make a wing angle change. You might be able to do a degree of wing to get yourself close to kind of your maximum, or you might be able to just drop the rear height, say 6 millimeters or something like that. And that's the most basic sense of how you can use the aero calculator. But with some other cars, so say something like the Dallara LMP2, you'll find that you also have a lot of different options in terms of body aero. So the LMP2 has two aero kit options. It has a low downforce and a standard kit option. It's kind of clues in the name, really, that the low downforce kit has obviously substantially less overall downforce, but it also has substantially less drag, which makes it a choice for, say, tracks like Le Mans and Daytona. Then there's other options. There's the wing angle option. There's number of dive planes. There's the deck and wing gurneys that you can either use or not use. And these cars that have all these multiple options tend to also have another calculation in there that's downforce to drag, and it's always referenced to 1 part drag. And the basic goal of this, again, is that the higher the downforce to drag number is, the more efficient the aero is, because we always want more downforce. There's really never a reason why you want less downforce. But what you don't want is you don't want the accompanying drag with it. So the goal is to get as much downforce per unit of drag as possible, and that's where the efficiency comes in. So you'll be able to see, say for the LMP2, what you'll notice is when you have no dive planes fitted, the efficiency is, I don't know, maybe 4.8 or something like. Well, the downforce to drag might be, say, something like 4.8. But then when you fit 1 dive plane, the downforce to drag might shoot up to 5 to 1, which is obviously quite good. But if you put a second one on, you'll find that the efficiency drops to 4.75 or something like that. Obviously that gives you a pretty good clue as to what the most efficient option is, and it's clearly the one only dive plane option. And obviously putting 2 on adds a substantial amount of drag. It might add a lot of downforce, but it adds a substantial amount of drag with it to the point that it's actually very inefficient to do this. Now, obviously then there comes in the trade-off as to what in certain situations it's going to be worth having a less efficient aero package just for more total downforce. But again, that's kind of taking it one step further, and the basic of the aero calculators tends to come down to the two things of trying to get as much downforce to drag as possible, because that's the best aero efficiency, and also trying to find the aero balance that suits you or the car the best. And I'll actually expand further on this in the future, because I've been playing around with a couple of things in telemetry to try and kind of help get maybe live aero balance channels based off of the aero calculator values. So I've been working on that. A couple of guys in Discord will have seen this already, and I do think that'll be very, very helpful when I kind of put all the information of that out there a little bit more. But I hope that was kind of a good introduction to it and so on. And that actually kind of feeds into the next question, which was, Will was asking, discuss the process behind adjusting ride heights on aero cars. What are you trying to achieve in corners, straights, etc.? Well, the biggest thing for me is I will look at a track and I will look at how long the straight... Well, the first thing I look at is what is the ratio of straightaways to corners, and kind of how long are the straightaways. If there is significant straightaways or a significant number of straightaways, are there any that are particularly long? So say, for example, if we took a track like Road Atlanta, the big thing there is obviously there's an extremely long straight. Now, does that mean that you sacrifice everything for straight line speed? No, it doesn't. Not in my opinion, anyway. And interesting, Road Atlanta is a track where you'll find that high, low, and, well, high and medium downforce setups, can, as I'll call them, can kind of be very, very similar to one another, because the high downforce car will extract a lot of speed through the S's and so on, so it'll gain quite a bit of time through there, and through turn 1 obviously as well. But the medium downforce car will gain a lot, or maybe even more, or back as it comes down the backstretch. So then that's a bit of a decision for you to make as to what's more important. And I would say in multi-class racing, straight line speed is one of the ones which is kind of actually at a bit of a premium, because it makes it easier for you to pass cars, and it means that if you get held up in the corners, it's not as detrimental as it would be otherwise. So say if you're in an LMP2 at Road Atlanta, if you're a high downforce setup, you have to be very, very, very ruthless with passing lower cars, especially through the turns, because if you're not, that's where all your advantage is, and that's where you're going to lose it. The other thing with the high downforce option is high downforce does tend to imply high drag, so you'll find it harder to pass slower class cars down the straightaways, because you will just not have as much raw speed, and you'll have to be making more aggressive moves under braking and so on. And this is before you get into how is it to race against other cars in your own class. Obviously, a lower drag car in your own class is going to be very, very difficult for you to pass in a straight line, even with draft assistance. So that's something to consider. But in terms of how I discuss, well, the process behind adjusting ride heights on aero cars. So down straightaways, I'm always trying to get the rear of the car quite low. It's not universal, but in the majority of cases, getting the rear of the car lower down tends to flatten out the body rake of the car, which tends to result in lower drag. So if I can, I'll actually try to run quite a soft rear spring, so that down the straightaway the rear end of the car sits down and reduces the drag some. Now, obviously that then changes around a bit in the corners, where your goal is to kind of have the aero platform where it wants to be. And as we just discussed, obviously if you have a soft spring, you get a lot of platform movement. Now, this is where it comes down to the track type. If it's a track that has a lot of tight corners and long straights, you can get away with running quite a soft rear spring. So a track like Daytona Road Course, actually, you can do this because there's not actually as many high speed corners as you might think. Realistically, the only high speed corner, so to speak, is actually the bus stop, and the rest of the track is pretty low speed corners. Turn 1 is not a high speed corner. The kink in the infield, that's not really a corner for a prototype car. And obviously the horseshoes and the corners back onto the oval are very slow speed. So in that case, I'm always kind of prioritizing the straight line speed. But at the same time, if I can get away with running a soft spring, which allows the rear to kind of pop up in the corners for in most cases, but not all, a little bit more downforce, then that's generally what I'll try and do. If it's a track like Spa where you have true high speed cornering situations, you can't really do that because what'll tend to happen is the rear of the car will sit down, the aero balance will change quite a bit, and you'll kind of be fighting that the whole time. So it comes down to the track type. If there's more true high speed corners, I'll try and get more platform stability by running stiffer tends to be stiffer rear springs. In most cases, I don't want to say set and forget the front of the car, but normally I try to set the front of the car up pretty much as stiff as the track surface will allow me to do so, and to try and really get as stable a front height control as possible, and then everything else is judged off the rear heights. And as I say, tracks that are more true high-speed cornering are the ones where I will generally run stiffer rear springs to get a bit more platform control. So what I'm trying to achieve there is the aero balance I want in the corners, whilst maximizing straight line speed and trying to get something for free, if you know what I mean. I'm not someone who buys into trying to run a car as stiff as a board the entire time around the track, because I actually find that generally results in a car that's running too low, in a rake sense, in low speed corners. And you actually start to run into mechanical issues in that sense, where the kind of, it's not an aero balance situation anymore. It's just the fact that the platform's so low and so flat, and the rear's so low in the corners that the thing mechanically just doesn't want to turn anymore. So that kind of becomes a limit there. But at the same time, with soft rear spring, it allows you to kind of have everything you want, because you'll get straight line speed. Moving on to another kind of spring related question from Jack. Could you go over setting up the right rear coil bind? So this is related to the NASCAR Cup Series car. And the right rear coil bind is an interesting option. It's available at tracks that are 1.5 miles and bigger. And it's pretty much what this is this allows you to run a very, very soft right rear spring initially. So I believe the range is 200 to 350 pounds per inch. And those are the bindable options, as they're called. Now, they're useful because what it allows you to do is it allows you to kind of have the car running at sort of a dummy ride height, so to speak. So you can actually start the car really, really high in the rear end. But because the spring rate is so soft at high load aero tracks, it'll just collapse all the way down. Now, obviously, if you just had a 250 or say a 200-pound spring in the right rear corner, that's going to be totally useless for holding the car up. So you're given this option to coil bind this corner of the car. So you can start with the really soft rate, let the car travel down in the rear, and then the coil binds, and the rate in theory becomes infinite. In practice, I like to always think that when the coil is bound, it's basically the same rate as if you used a regular 7,000 pounds per inch spring. So the advantages that you could possibly get with a coil bind spring is you can get a rear steer effect with the track bar rake, and you can also run a softer left rear spring as well, because you can start the car really high up and travel it down, and obviously, even though the right rear spring is effectively of zero stiffness until it lands on the bind spring, the left rear spring still has to travel and is still a linear spring. So on that corner of the car, you're able to get away with running a softer left rear spring because you can start the car higher, you can travel it down further. And even though the on-track ride height's the same as, say, a car with stiff linear springs, in the right rear at least, you won't have to run as stiff a left rear spring. So that can be an advantage on rough tracks. The downside is the coil band is a disadvantage on rough tracks, so it tends to sort of offset itself. In terms of kind of setting it up out of the box, it's not very easy, I'll say that. And it's not very easy because there's the issue in terms of how the bind spring is spec'd. Obviously, you've got those options where you can choose between the points where it binds, and I believe it goes from 2.8125 inches or something like that to 3.25 inches. Now, you can actually get a bit more range out of this by moving the right side truck arm mount. The higher you go on the right side truck arm mount, the earlier the spring will bind, and that's basically because it's moving the bucket up, because it's moving the arm, and the bucket's kind of moving higher up as well. So the spring's starting with inherently more preload, so then it binds earlier because it's already further in its travel. Now, the most effective way I've found of setting this up is really to just move it stages at a time with those bind travel limit options. I've messed around a little bit in the past trying to figure out if I can equate to what those numbers themselves actually mean. The most obvious thing that they should mean is the distance in terms of the spring compression to the point where it binds, and that's probably what we should use. But it's quite an easy setting to play with. So normally what I'll do is I'll go out on track, I'll look at what the ride height is. If it's not where I want it to be, say it's too low, then I'll reduce the travel to bind up until the point where I run out of range. And if I run out of range, then I'll move up on the truck arm mount until I get to the target ride height that I want. So actually, now moving on to our last question. It was also from Jack. How do you pronounce your last name? My last name is pronounced Challoner. And I know broadcasts are kind of all over the place with it, but yeah, that's how you say it. That's how I always say it. So, and yeah, that wraps up the Q&A, I guess. And if you guys have got any more questions, obviously feel free to put them in Discord. If you want to ask a question for Patreon Q&A, it's a tier 3 reward or higher, which is our so we have a $1 package, which is a tier 1 option. That's kind of just a gesture of support. Then there's the next step up, the $5 option, which is the tech tips. And the tech tips are coming. I am working on them. I know I said one would be out a couple of days ago. I'm actually trying to compile a little bit of a series together on those, which is actually going to focus on the aero calculators and how you can use them in a little bit more detail. So the Patreon guys can look out for those coming up soon. And then beyond that, we've got the tier 3, 4, and 5 options, which are a little bit more. So tier 3 gives you access to the Q&A and also allows you to send in a setup each month, and I will give you my thoughts on that setup and where I think you can improve it. I won't make any adjustments to that setup, and the reason I won't make any adjustments to that setup is because that's what we do in the tier 4 options. In the tier 4 rewards, we kind of, you can send in a setup once per week. I'll give you my thoughts on it, both in terms of what it looks like in the garage compared to kind of what I would be running for that track. Also, what I feel when I'm driving the car around, when I'm looking at telemetry and so on, and then I'll make my own series of changes to it, tell you why I made those changes, and then I'll send it back to you with a comparison in terms of run length of run times compared to what you originally sent me, along with a couple of suggestions in terms of what I would do further. And then the tier 5 is that plus a 3-hour session with me at a time of your choosing throughout the month. So yes, if anybody is watching this who isn't already a Patreon member or a member of the Discord, yeah, please join the Discord and check out those options if they interest you.